Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. With the name of Allah, we begin. And alhamdulillah, all praise belongs to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. And may the peace and blessings and salutations be upon his final messenger Muhammad and all his family and companions. So to proceed, in today's episode, we have decided here in the Tobago Islamic Learning Center at Masjid Abdullah ibn Abbas in Crown Point, Tobago, that we deemed it necessary for us to discuss some of the inconsistencies that has been propagated and has been happening in terms of false information spreading in our local community here, as well as the wider Tobago and Trinidad area, with regard to the current crisis and ongoing slaughter and genocide in Palestine by the Israeli government. Of course, this is a very sensitive topic, and for the past 20 days or so, we have seen the brutality of the Israeli army in slaughtering some 5,000 plus people, over 2,000 of which are children, over 1,100 of which are women. Hospitals have been bombed, destroyed indiscriminately. Mosques have been destroyed, places of worship, including churches. One of the oldest church in the world, the third oldest church in the world, was bombed, was being used as a shelter. So all these things that we see happening, we know that these are all violations of international law as well as any sort of moral code or standard. So we here in Tobago realize that many of the local population, being that we are in a tolerant society such as Trinidad and Tobago, we've realized that many of the people, because they perhaps have not done enough research, have not been exposed to the reality of the situation and the true facts that a lot of the Palestinian people are going through and what the history of the situation is, we felt that we should try to alleviate some of those falsities and some of those misconceptions to the general population. So we are here now with our brother, our teacher at the mosque, one of our teachers, Ustad Naveed Shakir. Ustad being his title, he's a teacher here, and he's a Khatib as well, also one of his titles. He gives the Friday sermon here at the mosque. And he's also a graduate of the University of Mecca in the Faculty of Aqidah, of Islamic beliefs. And he's been with us here several years now, and we'd like to discuss some of these inconsistencies in a bit more detail so that everybody can have a knowledge-based perspective when they are seeing the false narratives that are being spread on the Western media. I think most people in Tobago, pride themselves in being people that have become awakened to some of the lies and are conscious now of some of the, propaganda that has been happening in the West, in Western media especially. And it's important for us to have the proper perspective and the proper information and knowledge so we could continue to be tolerant to one another and understand where this conflict lies. So without further ado, I give our brother, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So first of all, Jazakallah khair, thanks for having me on and bringing up this topic, because just to reiterate some of the things that you said, it is very important for us, especially for us living here in Tobago. We've always had a very nice community in Tobago, a community that is very tolerant and accepting of others.
Definitely.
And this is one of the things that makes Tobago such a beautiful place to be and to live, is that we are comfortable with whatever we practice, wherever we go. We have friends and neighbors in this island. But of course, events outside of Tobago could affect our lives here.
Yes.
And so this is one of the examples in this latest unfortunate situation that has taken place. The conflict in Palestine has led to certain people adopting opinions and views which are not necessarily based on the facts. And it is an area that definitely needs to be explored and discussed, so that we have a better, broader understanding of what exactly is taking place and why so many things are happening.
Yes. Jazakallah khair. So I believe you made a very valid point. We've always been here in this community. We're here now about, the mosque here in Crown Point has been in existence over 12 years. And, alhamdulillah, all praise be to Allah. We've never had any problems. We've never had any sort of discrimination, and people have always been very tolerant of us. And I think for the most part, even the media and this channel here, Tobago Updates channel, that is has always been a patron of the Islamic opinions and the Islamic ideals, in the sense that they've always promoted that, broader perspective, and those, like you mentioned. So let's just jump right into it, because there's a few things we want to discuss and we want to clarify. And I think what has sparked this a lot too in the recent times, in the past 20 days or so since this has been going on, I think I've encountered, and yourself too, I think you mentioned this to me a few weeks ago, that you've encountered people who just make blanket statements that they're just regurgitating from the media. And perhaps, again, we excuse them, because we know that a lot of the things that they repeat is just things that they might have heard again in the media, or they might have heard from certain quote unquote biblical sources that may be inaccurate, or may be misrepresented, or misinterpreted, for a better way of putting it. So let's just jump right into it, right? And let's, from two angles. First of all, what is the origin of the conflict there in Palestine and Israel? What is the historical origin, rather? Let's talk about it more from the contemporary perspective then. Right. What's happening right now? So let's start from there, and we can work our way backwards.
Right. Well, what's happening right now, as many of us are aware, is, as you mentioned previously, no short of a genocide that is taking place at the hands of the Israeli army. They have been consistently bombing the area of Gaza, as well as outside of Gaza, the West Bank and elsewhere, what is collectively known as Palestine. The supposed cause of this was a rocket attack that took place October 7th, right? Mm-hmm. And it is reported that Hamas fired rockets into Israel, as well as entered into Israeli territory and killed and captured people. Now, this, of course, is no doubt, if true, we want to make this absolutely clear, right? Because we have to talk about who is Hamas and what they're about, right? And the fact that they don't actually represent Palestine, nor do they represent Islam or the Muslim community at large in the world. But the question is this something that really actually took place? I think research has been done, and I know we've discussed this before, where it is very questionable because of the fact that Israel has one of the most advanced weapon defense systems, the Iron Dome, exactly, the Iron Dome as they call it, right? And of all the rockets that have been fired, right? You remember the actual figures, right? Of all the rockets that were fired.
21st century. Mm-hmm.
So in the last 23 years then, right? What was the exact figure?
There was 36, they said, round off with a 10% margin of error, there was 36,000 rockets or mortars fired from the year 2000 to the year 2023.
Exactly, and only 69 people were actually killed. Right.
A number of cows and goats as well.
Right. And that's not to take away from the seriousness of the deaths of the innocents, right?
But just to show the
exactly. Yeah. So, and this is something we need to make absolutely clear. The Qur'an condemns the killing of innocent people, right? And we stand by this position in Islam. And we have always, in this masjid and in our community in Tobago and elsewhere around the world, people of the Sunnah have always condemned the acts of violence and terrorism that are ascribed to Islam, incorrectly ascribed to Islam, I should say, right? Because this is not from Islam in any way. But the issue here now is not so much whether this is an atrocity or not, because no doubt the killing of any civilian life is wrong. But the issue is this something that actually took place at the hands of Hamas? Right? As I said before, Hamas does not represent the Muslims, nor do they, and this is very important for us to understand because it leads to the conflict, they do not represent the Palestinian government. Right? So, as some may be unaware, Palestine has existed for a long time, and it has its own government. That government has been recognized by a number of countries around the world. Unfortunately, some of the countries in the West still refuse to recognize Palestine. But the militias that take these attacks or initiate these attacks, they do not represent the Palestinian government. And we should know that any act of war is the responsibility of the government, not the responsibility of militias. So the militias do not speak for the Palestinian government, nor do they speak for the people of Palestine.
Right.
And I think that's something very important that we have to make clear.
I mean, let's be honest, right? This conflict didn't begin on October 7th.
No.
Right? This is going back, I mean, in the modern times, it's going back 75 years. It's perhaps even older than that if we really want to get into it. But, you know, this idea that the Palestinian people, whether it was Hamas or it wasn't Hamas, whether it was, because some people are reporting it was a conglomerate of several resistance fighters, if you will, you know, the Popular Liberation Front, or not sure the exact names, you know, did this attack. Now, again, if it was true, and any innocent people were killed, that's another issue. Would they really? I mean, again, yes, there are innocent people, but you have to understand the Israeli population is a militarized population. So at the end of the day, it's mandatory for every adult male at the age of 17 to go into the military. So in fact, almost all of the people who was in that festival, just, you know, as a side point, were actually from the military. But keeping that aside, it's, you know, for them to frame it as, you know, the media frames it as Hamas, this barbaric entity that committed these atrocities and it's the worst atrocity, etc. Let's be honest. How is it an atrocity when a country under occupation, brutal occupation at that, something the likes of which the world has not seen in modern times, except for perhaps what was done in South Africa, because it is an apartheid. The UN and several entities has labeled what has happened in what is going on in Israel for the past 75 years as nothing else other than apartheid. Everybody who knows what apartheid is will know it's a completely racist system that dehumanizes one race over another. So let's be honest, they try to, you know, frame it as resistance, the resistance fighters, Hamas, and they're so barbaric as to contextualize it in a way so that they could now come in and say, well, we have to have this response where we come now and just annihilate man, woman, and child. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, the reality is, why is it that resistance is considered, because at the end of the day, this is an occupation. So how could resistance be considered, you know, improper? At the end of the day, anybody under occupation, even the UN and international law states that anybody under occupation has a right to resist. Just look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Everybody knows Ukraine has a right to resist, but all of a sudden the Palestinians don't. So, going back to the point, we want to talk a little bit now about... Well,
let's touch on some of the things you mentioned, right? Because I just want to make some things clear. Now, regardless of the fact that civilians have military training or not,
right,
anyone who is not in that situation of combat, they're not combatants, right?
Correct.
So we need to always be fair and balanced.
And I appreciate you saying that. That's something that we need to, because our rules of engagement in Islam are very specific.
Exactly.
So if there is any sort of battle or war, the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet peace be upon him, was very specific about how we attack and where we attack and what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. So 100%, that's a good point.
Exactly.
But the point is, you know, they try to frame it up as if they were these innocent people that were just, you know, minding their business, and, you know, absolutely. And again, they want the world to condemn Hamas. They want everybody. First thing, anybody goes on to any talk show or anybody speaks up on behalf of Palestine, first thing they say is, do you condemn Hamas? Sure, we condemn Hamas. We don't have a problem condemning the killing of innocent people. But do you condemn the past 75 years? Just prior to October 7th, maybe a week or two before that, they were, you know, kicking Muslim women in hijab that was reading Qur'an in front of the mosque in Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. They shot up a 14-year-old boy, a sniper, who was standing too close to the fence. They said he was standing too close to the fence, unarmed, right? But
Right.
then what Israel says, they say, oh well, he was in an attack posture, and the world takes their word for it. They don't allow any independent investigations.
Right.
Nobody's allowed, no human rights is allowed to go in after. But of course, later on we find out they do independent investigations and find out that these people were completely unarmed. So.
Exactly.
Let's stick to the course of the discussion. Again, we want to go back to the origin of the conflict now. So we
Right.
spoke about what's happening now contemporarily, the origin of the conflict.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
How did
what,
this all
what caused
begin?
this and where does
Yeah,
it come
yeah.
from? Exactly. Well, we could approach this from a number of perspectives, and let's start off with the most recent, which is
Right.
what is actually the situation of those living in Palestine now,
Right.
right? And when I say Palestine, I'm talking about the country of Palestine as well as what is known as Israel,
Right.
right? And we need to understand that the history of those living in Palestine is not something that just goes back 75 years or 100 years,
Right.
right? This is something that goes back from to the time of Umar ibn al-Khaṭṭāb,
Right.
which is, let's say, not too long after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, about 4 years or so after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So we had, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we had Abu Bakr, and then after 2 years, Abu Bakr passed away, and then Umar.
Right.
In the time of Umar, the Muslims expanded, and they reached the land of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is very important for us to understand how this took place, right? This was not as the West, and even some Muslim sources may translate it as a conquest, right?
Right.
Fath
Fatah
is the correct word for that, and right, and it's not a conquest, right? Conquest implies that there must be some sort of
battle
combat,
or
and
fight.
exactly,
Mhm.
right? And the reality is that in many of these situations, that was not the case, right? The Muslims went to spread Islam. They offered Islam to the people. They made them an offer to accept the religion of monotheism, pure monotheism, and those who accept, they welcomed in
Right.
as brothers in faith. And anyone who refused, they have the option to join the Muslim country
Right.
and be under their protection
Right.
without serving in the military,
Right.
right? And they would have to pay what's called a jizya,
Mm-hmm.
as we Muslims pay zakat.
Right.
They would pay the jizya.
Yeah, and I mean, as a tribute, any empire that went into any country,
Exactly.
they
So
would
it's
make
not
people
something
pay taxes.
unfair. Some
Oh,
people
yeah.
try to, frame it as some kind of unfair
Yeah, yeah,
tax
no,
or
of course
something.
not.
No.
The Roman Empire did it, the
Exactly.
Persian Empire, every
Right.
empire in the world did it.
Regardless of it, Muslims paid zakat,
Zakat, which is a poor
exactly,
tax towards the
and
poor.
the non-Muslims paid jizya, right? So
Correct.
everybody paid towards
So it was
the
equal.
safety of the country and the distribution of the economy. So
That's right.
to better the society. Now those who chose to fight against the Muslim army, that was their choice,
Right.
right? If they wanted to fight, they did so. There was also another option, which is peace treaty,
Right.
right? And this is actually how Jerusalem was entered,
Yes.
under peace treaty.
Yeah.
We should note that when the Muslims went to Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas were actually under Christian rule,
Yeah.
not Jewish rule.
Right.
The Jews did not occupy that land. They did
Right.
not have rule over that land,
Right.
right? It was under the Roman Empire,
Correct.
sometimes referred to, or oftentimes referred to in the West as the Byzantine Empire,
Right.
right? But the proper name, as they would call themselves,
Roman
is the
Empire.
Roman Empire,
Yes.
because they succeeded Rome
Right.
in the West when it fell.
It's the Roman Christian Empire.
And
Just
this
to be
is the
specific.
Christian,
Yeah, it's a
right?
Christian
Exactly. This
empire,
is the
yeah.
Christian Roman Empire,
Right.
right? So, of course, we know from the history of that region and in the history of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, he would have written letters to Herakl, who was one of the leaders, right? Exactly. And of course, Islam was known at that point in time. We should also point out that these Christians had, by that point in time, and this is way before Islam, right? We're talking about possibly centuries before Islam even came out of the Arabian Peninsula. These Christians had already spoken the Arabic language. They had adapted the Arabic language, or adopted the Arabic language for themselves, right? Many of them would have been of Assyrian origin, or other tribes from that region, right? And they would have adopted the Arabic language themselves, which is important to understand, because we will say oftentimes, and we hear that Palestine is for the Arabs and so forth. We should understand something about the word Arab. Arab is not an ethnicity as we think of it in the West, right? We have this concept of race, which is a modern concept. In Arabic, in the Arabic language, an Arab is anyone of Arab lineage, Arab birth, meaning in the land of the Arabs, or someone who speaks the Arabic language, right? So all of these people, regardless of their lineage, regardless of their origin, they would be considered Arab to us, right? Now they were Christian. So as I said, when Umar actually entered the city of Jerusalem, or before he entered the city of Jerusalem, when the Muslims reached the city of Jerusalem, the Christians who were in charge of that area, they recognized from their books that they were to hand over the keys to the followers of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And interestingly, when the first Muslims arrived, they did not hand over the keys because they said that there's a specific description. Right. So they wanted to give the keys to Umar because that was the command in their book. Right. Now, they did not have a name, but they knew his description. So when the Muslims spoke to them and they said, "Who is it exactly you're waiting for?" they described this individual and they said, "That is Umar ibn al-Khaṭṭāb," and they sent for Umar to come. Right. So when Umar arrived, we should note that some very important things took place. Right. Number one, when Umar arrived, he was in a way tested by some of the Christians because he wanted to go to the rock where the Prophet ﷺ would have ascended from. Right. Exactly. You don't know the rock, right? So they took him to a different place, and he immediately recognized that this is not the correct place. Right. Then they took him to another place, and he recognized that this is not the correct place. So it shows that the Christians had knowledge of the Muslims, and the Muslims had knowledge of the Christians and Jerusalem, right? And what was in it. So when they took Umar to the correct place, they actually offered him, and this is another narration, they actually offered for him to pray because he wanted to pray when he arrived in Jerusalem. They wanted him to pray in the church.
The Church of Sepulchre, if I'm not mistaken, no?
Perhaps, I'm not sure the exact. But Umar refused, right? And the reason for that was?
I think because he said, if I pray here, people will make it into a mosque.
Exactly. Which shows, look at how Muslims were trying to preserve the rights of the non-Muslims there. Right? So they gave the Christians their rights, and they even preserved their own historical sites and their churches, places of worship.
Further to that, if I could just interject for a second, what I remember also from the historical account is that when Omar came to Jerusalem, and they finally took over and they handed the keys over to the city to him, the Temple Mount was actually used as a trash dump.
SubhanAllah.
And that's one of the places that the Jews would, held as sacred, and even the Christians. But for centuries it was out of use, and he actually restored that for them. So the Jewish worship was restored, and it actually became a place of high significance to the Muslims as well. So we were the ones who restored that, and we restored Jewish worship in the city of Jerusalem, something that the Christians didn't do for the Jews. So.
Right, exactly, and that just shows to the reality of the fact is that Muslims were the ones to bring about the most benefit to all of the various factions living in the area, because as you correctly stated, right, the Christians, of course, would have been intolerant to the Jews, holding to the fact that the Jews killed Jesus according to them, right? They were intolerant of the Christians, and it is fact. The Jews were always intolerant of the Christians.
That's right.
And so when the Christians took power, they were intolerant of the Jews, right? And it was the Muslims who brought some semblance of peace and reconciliation between everybody. And the Muslims were the ones who allowed for each one to practice what they did, right? So, and as you correctly stated, that is absolute fact. The Muslims were the ones to restore these sites, and this is of great importance because we hold these things as important for us, right? And we do not allow for anyone else to oppress on other people,
Yeah.
right?
Regardless
So it's not something we would
if they're
do.
Muslim or non-Muslim.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So even between the Christians and the Jews, we would not allow that to happen,
Yeah.
right? It's not their place to do that.
I mean, no, I'm just, what I wanted to say, let's conceptualize the whole thing now, right? Let's take the whole picture of it. Obviously, Jerusalem and the lands around Jerusalem is the area where, what we call Palestine back then. Well, back then they didn't call it Palestine. Of course, later on the name came about. But what I'm saying is, in that area, the Jews and Christians lived harmoniously with the Muslims. The Jews always had a home in Palestine. The Jews never felt any form of oppression. As a matter of fact, we gave history will attest to the fact that we gave them their own courts. We allowed them to rule themselves within their own laws and so on, as long as they stayed within a certain framework. So, the Christians that lived in the land of Jerusalem at that time, that accepted the Muslims to come in, I think even in the historical account, they were expecting an onslaught. In some accounts mentioned that they thought the army was going to come and it was going to be a big butchering and a big slaughter, and none of that occurred. So, that's
and thanks for that. Just to mention something. Now, in terms of the name Palestine, that name has been there, right? It is Palestine, right? Yeah. And it has been there for centuries going back, before the Muslims, before the
let's talk about that.
Christians.
Let's go back now before this event.
Well, what I wanted to finish up this topic here, which is the modern day people, right? Because we started off with the time of Umar, so we need to understand that from that time, the time of Umar ibn Al-Khaṭṭāb, the Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived harmoniously there. Despite certain incidents that would have taken place throughout the history, such as the Crusades, when the Crusaders came, the European Christians came, they of course harmed not only the Muslims and the Jews, but even Christians,
even Christians, correct? That's
right. So
dogs, cats, everybody,
everything,
and that's from their history books.
That is from their history books, right? They even ate the flesh of people, right? So. That was, of course, one of the most brutal periods of that time
in history,
right? And then when the Muslims were able to secure it again under the leadership of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, right? It came back to being a land of peace and tolerance, right? So we should note that the Christians and Jews under the various Muslim rulers from the Khulafa Rashidin, what we call the Rashidin era, to the Umayyads, to the Abbasids, and moving all the way down, the various Muslims that occupied that land always had tolerance for Christians and Jews, up until we reach including the Ottomans, right? So the Ottomans also protected the Jews and Christians. We should also note that when the Christians of Spain started to attack the Muslims and Jews in Andalus, it was the Muslims who harbored the Jews and protected them.
Sanctity. That's
correct.
Right. That's right.
So absolutely. The Jews have always been in our lands under protection. Till today, there are Jews that live in Yemen. There are Jews that live in elsewhere in the Muslim world, in Morocco.
I mean, listen, not to cut you, but that could be validated. That is absolutely 100%. Quantified, because there's Jews now. They call them Jews for Palestine. And I think that is one of the points we need to make here. Islam has never had any problems in terms of our coexistence with the Jews. The entity that we have problems with today is a political movement by the name of Zionism. And of course, we might get to that at the end of our talk. But the Jewish people, that is why if you see a lot, it's coming out quite a lot now. If you look at the media, social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, you're seeing these rabbis coming out with the Palestinian flags, and they're saying, listen, we don't sanction what the state of Israel is doing.
The state of Israel does not represent all Jews, and certainly does not represent the Jewish religion. According to Jewish religion, all of this is criminal. All of this is forbidden. Basics of Jewish belief teaches that Jews are in a divinely decreed exile. We are even forbidden to create a sovereignty for ourselves. But especially when this is by killing, stealing, oppressing an entire people.
Jews have a golden history in the Muslim countries. For centuries. We live in Muslim countries. Sorry, try not to hear it. much better than in the other countries.
Oh yeah, it's true. Yeah, we burned the Jews.
We live much better in the Muslim. Everybody knows the history, knows that. And I must tell you, even today, after 75 years of killing, 75 years of occupation, 75 years of blood, yes, go in any Muslim country, they are welcoming Jews.
And you will see that religiously, in their as a matter of doctrine, the real Jews, the ones who were native to the land and the ones who practiced the religion the way that, closest to the way they consider authentic. Of course, we know the Torah has been lost and so on, the Torah of Moses, but that's another topic. They're saying that, and according to their religious belief, the origin of which they're saying is that the state of Israel should not be in existence.
Correct, as it is today.
Yeah, as it is today. Yeah. As a matter of fact, for them, as a form of belief, Israel will only be formed when the true Messiah comes, according to them. So as far as they're concerned, Israel is an illegal state too. So again, we'll get to that point, I think, lower down in the conversation. What I want to go to now is, if we go back, I think we just have a few minutes for this episode, and I think we'll have to continue this for a few different talks. Okay. This was a wonderfully elaborate talk, and I think a lot of information. If our viewers are really sincere, they will go into some of these details and do your own research as well. I always mention the non-Muslim professor at Austin University. His name is Roy Casagrande. He has a wonderful account. It's called, the video on YouTube is called The Crusades. He has a wonderful account of all of what we spoke about from the Christian
perspective
books, history books, and everything that you said, he's validated in those talks, talking about how and he gives names and everything as well, about the Christian monk who came out to meet Omar, and when they saw Omar coming into the city, he was in tattered clothing, and he was pulling his servant on a horse.
That's a good point. That it's not just our perspective.
Exactly.
It's a historical fact.
They could twist the facts as much as they want. Remember, history is written by the victor. So at the end of the day, we know that there's a certain history that is taught in textbooks, let's say, but the reality is the truth is the truth. And we firmly believe that Al-Haq, Allah, will bring the truth forward as long as we are sincere. So the Jews that are there now, and we would see later on that they are actually Jews that were converted to Judaism. They are not the actual indigenous Jews of the region, the ones who we're talking about in history. These are European Jews, these Zionist Jews. They go by different names, but they are the ones that claim that this land is a promised land for them. Now, if we go back to before the time of Omar, let's go way back to the first, I don't want to use the word Israelite or the first Jew, but the first believer, let's call him believer, which is Abraham. Peace be upon him, Ibrahim in Arabic. He was actually the first Semite, if you will, and we'll talk about this word perhaps a little later on as well, that entered into that land. Before that, he met people living there, indigenous people, which would have been, of course, they were pagans, they were non-believers, but Abraham at the time was the only believer on earth. And we say Abraham is a Muslim, but at the same time, and based on the definition of Islam, that he was the one who submitted to God and so on, carrying the banner, the flag bearer of monotheism, pure monotheism of the land. So Abraham entered there. But when Abraham entered there, who is the father of all the Jews, and you could talk about that, I guess, he met people there. So before we move on to that question, what I want to, let's finish off this one topic here, right? Because we're talking about the Jews that were in Palestine at the time of Omar, when he came into and the Muslims took control of the land, to now,
till today,
right? Are they the same Jews? Are these the people that are there today? What is the origin of these people?
Correct. So this is a good question to ask, right? Because we said that the last basically we went from one empire to another until we reached the Ottomans, right? Now it's important to note that after that point, there have always been a population of Jews that lived in that area, right? But they are a minority, right? There are also Jews that lived in Iraq and in Yemen and elsewhere, in Morocco and other places, right? So what occurred is that after World War II, the Ottomans lost control of that land, right? Which is Palestine, Sham in general, and it was taken up and divided by Western powers. Britain claimed Palestine, right? And when they occupied Palestine, they made a promise to the Jews of Europe to bring them and have them take this land. right? Now, of course, this promise is not their place. It's not their land to give, right?
First of all.
Exactly, right? It's not the English land to give. And these people that were coming in are not the Jews that were from the Middle East. They're not the Jews that descend.
Indigenous, they weren't the indigenous ones.
They're not indigenous, and they're also not the descendants of Beni Israel.
The
Right?
tribe of Israel.
The tribe of Israel, right?
Right.
Exactly. So
That's important, eh?
it is, because in Hebrew they call them Bnei Israel.
Right.
In Arabic we call them Beni Israel.
Right.
Very similar. And these are the actual people that are referred to in the holy books,
Right.
right? So when we talk about the Jews, we have to understand that there are two groups. We have Beni Israel, right? The children of Israel. They are the tribes that descend
They
from.
have a bloodline too.
They have a bloodline to Israel, who is Yaqub,
Yeah,
Jacob,
yeah.
and of course through him to
Not
Abraham, right?
Yeah.
And not all of them are Jews,
Right.
okay? And we also have,
Sorry, when you say not all of them are Jews.
what I mean, not all of them are Jews, is the term Jewish or the term Jew is reference to one of the sons,
Judah.
Judah, exactly, right?
One of
And
the sons of Jacob, right?
of Jacob, right? And this name would have come about after,
Right.
right? So it would not have been in their time.
So it's not so the Jews, when we say Jews, they're not all of Beni Israel,
No,
the tribe of
no,
Israel.
the ones that we refer to as the Asbat, which are the actual
Tribes.
children
Mhm.
of Yaqub,
Jacob, yeah.
of Jacob,
Mhm.
those 12 sons, right, which includes Joseph,
Yeah,
Yusuf,
yeah.
right, Benjamin, Benjamin, and so forth,
Levi,
and all of
etc.
them, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
They would not have called themselves Jews,
Right.
right? Now their
That's
lineage,
important.
right?
Yeah.
Their lineage, those are the ones we call Beni Israel, the children of Israel,
Right.
right? We have to talk on the point that where they actually lived, because they didn't actually live there, right?
Right.
But we need to understand that what the text refers to is these people. Now, on the other side, we have the word Jew, right? Which refers to the followers of the Jewish religion,
Right.
right? And that as a religion, although it has strong ties to lineage, because for the most part, Jews don't allow people to
convert.
enter the religion, right? But in the history of Judaism, there have been significant people that have accepted Judaism, converted to Judaism, and therefore led to the population booming, the Jewish population booming in certain areas. So, for example, there was a king who would be in present-day Russia, right? Now, obviously, back then it wasn't Russia,
called
right?
Russia, yes.
So Central Asia,
Central Asia, that area,
right?
yeah.
This individual accepted Judaism, and a lot of the European Jews
Descend from him.
not necessarily descend from him specifically, but from his people.
Right.
Because when he accepted Judaism,
He
his
converted
kingdom,
people.
exactly, the kingdom accepted Judaism, right? As was the practice of the
Right.
past.
So the bottom line is, these people who are there now, who call themselves Jews, are in fact European converts from the Central Asian,
Correct.
Russian area.
Correct. They have
who
no ties to the
blood
land.
lineage to Israel.
They have no blood
To the
lineage to
tribe-
Israel,
To the tribes of Israel.
and they have no claim to the land because they were never there.
Allah.
It was not their land,
Yeah.
right? So we mentioned a few good points here, which is that the Christians had this land before.
Right.
They gave it to the Muslims
Right.
by peace treaty,
Right.
right? The Muslims allowed them to stay. The Jews that were there at that time are not the same as the current country of Israel, which exists today. These people came from Europe. They don't have the same bloodline as Beni Israel.
So even if they make the claim that they are, this land was
promise.
given to them and was promised to them, it wasn't given to them.
It wasn't to these
Not
people.
these people.
Correct.
Allah Akbar.
Right? Not
That's
to these
so,
people.
that's so vital, because
Exactly.
a lot of people misunderstand that.
Exactly.
Because if you go back to the Jews that were indigenous in Israel or in Palestine, in the area known as Israel today, the indigenous ones that lived peacefully for the past 1400 years or so, since the time of Omar, since the time of Omar, let's say, since the Muslims were in control, they've always been there. So if you were to look at the promise, let's say, that God gave to them, and we want to discuss that in future
we'll
episodes.
talk about that.
We'll talk about the actual promise in the
Inshallah.
Bible and so on. But if you go back to the promise that they were given, this promised land, the reality is they inherited that promise because they lived there.
They lived there,
there,
correct.
and they lived there in peace, and they were allowed to practice their religion. They were allowed to live peaceably.
So now, to sum it up, what leads to the conflict that occurs today is the taking over of land by individuals who have no claim to this land.
That's right.
Right, and no right to this land. Unjustly. It was given to them by the British, who have no control or no right to give that land to them. They came and they were given the dream that this was a land with no people, for a people with no land. Right? That is absolutely false.
And it's just to, you're giving us a nice religious perspective and alhamdulillah, historical perspective to all praises to Allah. Such a wealth of knowledge. But just to look at it now from a somewhat political angle, because the treaty, I think it was called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. That was right after World War II, as you mentioned. World War II or World War One?
World War II.
World War II, yes. And the colonial powers, and if we look at it historically, a lot of the chaos that occurred in the world post World War II at the hands of the colonial powers, splitting up lands that did not belong to them.
Exactly.
Even if we go further to that, in the 1500s, there was a protocol known as the Doctrine of Discovery, and the viewers could look it up. The Doctrine of Discovery was brought up by the Pope,
by the Church,
and funny enough, that was only annulled in March 2023.
Right.
Let me repeat that. The Doctrine of Discovery was only annulled in March of this year, 2023. In other words, what is the Doctrine of Discovery? It states that Spain, the Holy Spanish Empire, was given all of the Western world, and Portugal was given all of the Eastern world. Why? Based on a religious fervent doctrine, extremist doctrine, that they have the right to these lands because they were Christian. The Christians have a right to this land over the indigenous people who were pagans. So it was all based on a supremacist ideology.
Correct.
And that same supremacist ideology is what the Europeans did to split up lands that didn't belong to them.
Exactly.
And, of course, post-World War II, it had a lot to do with oil. Palestine was taken by the British. They took Iraq as well. All based on the fact that there was oil and certain things. And then, of course, the Zionist movement started around the same time as well, which is a movement from those same Jews you're talking about, those so-called European Jews who claim the lineage of Israel, but in reality, they're Europeans. They're white Caucasian Europeans.
And what occurred, unfortunately, is that when they came in, the Muslims, and this is very important to note, the Muslims, when the Jews came in, a lot of the Muslims were accepting of them.
Yeah, they gave them refuge.
They gave them refuge. They brought them in their houses.
Yes,
right,
absolutely.
And
they came in shiploads.
Exactly. And there's records of this. Muslims would bring them in their house, and if the Muslims left, the Jews would lock the door and take the house.
No, there was massive, major accounts of them coming into the land, we taking them in as refugees, the Palestinians taking them as refugees,
giving them food, giving them shelter,
giving them land, giving them house. And what did they do? They deceived the Muslims and actually started terrorist attacks within the lands and taking over people's lands. So again, we will. I guess we can elaborate a little bit more. This is what led to the conflict today. Yes, exactly. That's the point. So, alhamdulillah, it was an excellent talk today. May Allah bless you and all the viewers. We ask that Allah, first of all, we make a dua that Allah alleviate and aid our brothers and sisters in Palestine. For indeed, Allah is al-Khair al-Nasirin. He's the best of helpers, and we look towards Him to give us the victory, if you will, or the alleviate the stress and the pains and the crisis that is happening over there, the bloodshed, the oppression, absolutely. And Allah does not accept oppression. Allah does not accept oppression, no matter what, at the hands of the Muslims. In a famous narration, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, by the meaning of which, he said, Allah has made oppression on Himself, so do not oppress one another. And it means, He's made haram on Himself. Sorry, He's made oppression haram on Himself. So we need to stand for justice wherever it is. We need to speak up for injustice, and we need to let people know the facts, and that is our intent here. We hope that Allah, the mighty and the majestic, gives us the strength and the energy to see the truth and the right and the power to call to it, and to see the falsehood for what it is, and to warn others against it. And we ask that you give us your heart and your mind, and give us an open mind when you come to the facts that we are displaying here for you today and presenting. And we will continue next week, inshallah. God willing. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.